Clara remembered the wind on the cliff. It was the coldest of winters. The wind poured in from the Huangpu River, wrapped in damp chill, drilling inch by inch into her bones. She lay prone on the gravel, her right arm gone from the elbow down. Her blood congealed into dark brown scabs. In her ears was Vivian's laughter as sharp as shattered glass. "Brother, look at her now, how ugly she is." "Clara." George's voice came from above, as calm as if he were reviewing a contract. "The doctor says your hand is completely useless. Our Liu family cannot support a cripple. Move out." She wanted to say, "I did it to save your sister," but only bloody foam surged in her throat. That night, she froze to death at the edge of the cliff. She died amidst the mockery of the person she had risked her life to save, and died in the indifference of the man she had loved for 3 years. "Clara, what are you spacing out for?" Clara snapped her eyes open. Before her wasn't a cliff, but the living room of the Liu family villa. The crystal chandelier was dazzlingly bright, and the logs in the fireplace crackled, popping with sparks. She looked down at her hands, intact, slender, with neatly trimmed nails. She froze. "Clara!" Vivian's voice rang out again, tinged with her usual impatience. "Are you even listening to me?" Clara slowly raised her head. 2 people were sitting on the sofa opposite her. Vivian, 20 years old, wearing a pink Chanel suit with her legs crossed. Beside her was Summer, in a white dress with long straight black hair, eyes downcast, fingers twisting together, looking as if she were about to burst into tears at any moment. Clara stared at Summer. In her past life, this woman had sent her a message on the eve of her wedding. "Clara, thank you for stepping aside. George said he never loved you." Then she had blocked her. Later on, Summer swept away all the Liu family's liquid assets and flew off into the sunset with William. While George lay in the ICU, she was sunbathing on a yacht in Sanya. "Clara," Vivian tapped the coffee table. "I'm saying you should break up with my brother. You've been together for so long, and you know perfectly well how he treats you. Why not do us and Summer a favor?" "Summer is the one my brother truly likes." Summer looked up, her eyes rimmed with red, though her voice didn't waver in the slightest. "Clara, I know you're a good person. You'll make us happy, won't you?" Clara suddenly smiled. She stood up and walked to the wine cabinet, pouring herself half a glass of red wine. The amber liquid left fine teardrops on the side of the glass. She carried the glass back to the sofa, sat down opposite the 2 of them, crossed her legs and took a slow, leisurely sip. "You're right," she said. "George does deserve someone better." Vivian and Summer froze at the same time. They had prepared a whole speech, mockery, moral coercion, tearful accusations, but Clara's reaction was completely off script. "Clara, you..." Summer shifted uneasily. Clara set down her glass, the base striking the marble coffee table with a crisp sound. "Since you've gone to such great lengths to lock down this ill-fated relationship," she stood up and took out her phone from her bag, "I'll certainly grant your wish." She dialed George's number. It rang 3 times before he picked up. "Hello." George's voice carried his usual detachment. "What is it?" "We're breaking up." There was a second of silence on the other end of the line. "What did you say?" "I said let's break up." Clara watched the faces of the 2 women opposite her turn pale instantly, the corners of her mouth lifting slightly. "George, you're free." She hung up, opened WeChat, found that couple profile picture. A sunset over the Huangpu River she had taken herself. Tapped delete friend and confirmed the block. Smooth and fluid, without a moment's hesitation. Vivian stood with her mouth open, while Summer's lips began to tremble. "Clara, are you serious?" Vivian stammered. Clara downed the remaining wine in her glass in one go, set the cup down and walked toward the door. "Oh, by the way," she stopped without turning back. "Summer, the Liu family can't pay off all the debts you owe. Don't say I didn't warn you." Summer's face instantly went pale. Clara pushed the door open and stepped into the Shanghai winter night. The wind poured down her collar, so cold that she shivered. Yet she felt more wide awake than ever before. She looked down at her hands. There wasn't a single scratch on them. She clenched her fists, her knuckles turning white. The final scenes of her past life flashed through her mind. The loose gravel at the edge of the cliff, the blood that had drained away, her body losing sensation inch by inch in the extreme cold. But now, she stood at the entrance of the Liu family villa. Behind her was the brightly lit mansion. Ahead of her lay the crisscrossing streets of Shanghai. In the distance, a delivery rider brushed past her, the plastic bags in the bike basket rustling loudly. She took a deep breath and a white mist dispersed before her. This time she wouldn't strive for anyone else. This time she would live only for herself. She dug up a long dormant number from her contacts: Vincent, her senior from university, and the founder of the handmade fabric brand Weiyu. In her past life, she had considered the industry undignified, and politely declined his 3 invitations. Later, while she was toiling away like a beast of burden for the Liu family, she heard that Weiyu had become a leading brand in the domestic handicraft sector. She pressed the call button. It rang for a long time, so long that she thought he wouldn't pick up. "Hello." A gentle male voice with a hint of surprise. "Clara? Haven't been in touch for years." "Senior Vincent." Clara's voice was steady, but her fingers holding the phone were trembling. "Is the collaboration you mentioned before still valid?" There was a few seconds of silence on the other end of the line. "Of course." His voice carried a hint of a smile. "I've been waiting for you." Clara closed her eyes for a moment. Behind her, the lights of the Liu family villa went out one by one. She turned and walked into the depths of the night. George stared at the darkening phone screen, frowning. "Break up," he scoffed. Clara was throwing a tantrum. She had done this too many times over the past 3 years, because he forgot anniversaries, because he stayed up late entertaining clients, because his sister said something mean again. Every time she would cry, make a scene, and beg him to coax her, and then he would just say a few sweet words and she would soften. This time was no different. He tossed his phone face down on the desk and went back to reviewing the contract. There was an $8 million deal to sign tonight. He didn't have time to play her games. "Mr. George," the assistant said, knocking as he entered. "Miss Summer is waiting for you downstairs." George raised his head, the furrow between his brows relaxing. "Let her up." Summer pushed the door open and entered, wearing a beige knit sweater, her long hair draped smoothly over her shoulders, carrying an insulated bag in her hand. "George," she walked to the table, her voice soft as cotton candy. "I made soup, drink it while it's hot. Vivian told me Clara today." "She's just throwing a tantrum." George interrupted her, opening the thermal bag as the aroma of the soup wafted out. "Don't worry about it." Summer bit her lip, hesitating to speak. "What's wrong?" "It's nothing." She lowered her head, fingers twisting the corner of her shirt. "I just feel like Clara seems really sad. Do you want to give her a call?" George thought for a moment, picked up his phone and dialed. "The subscriber you are calling is currently on the line." The call was hung up. He dialed again. "The subscriber you are calling is currently on the line." Hung up on again. His expression darkened. He opened WeChat, typed, "Stop messing around," and hit send, a red exclamation mark. The other party has enabled friend verification. George stared at that line of text, his thumb hovering over the screen, pausing for several seconds. "George." Summer leaned over cautiously. "What's wrong?" "Nothing." He tossed his phone back onto the table, picked up the soup bowl and took a sip, the heat numbing the tip of his tongue. "If she wants to make a scene, let her. She'll come back on her own in a couple of days." What he didn't know was that at this very moment, Clara was sitting by the window of a 24-hour convenience store. A bank card and an ID card spread out before her. These were the only belongings she had brought out of the Liu family home. When she moved in 3 years ago, she had brought 2 suitcases. When she moved out 3 years later, she only took these. She looked at her reflection on the glass window. Pale face, slightly sunken eyes, a faint line at the corner of her mouth left from biting her lower lip for so long. Truly ugly. She touched her face, recalling the final days of her previous life when she practiced smiling in the mirror every day because Vivian had said, "You look so sour all day, it annoys everyone who sees you." She left the woman in the reflection who tried to please others on the glass, stood up, and pushed the door open to leave. At 10 o'clock the next morning, Clara stood before an old Western-style house. Red brick walls were covered with withered vines, and several pots of pothose on the wrought iron balcony glistened with an oily sheen under the winter sun. A walnut sign hung at the entrance, engraved with 2 characters in slender gold script. Jiyu. She pushed the door open and the doorbell chimed, the scent of fabric and coffee wafting out. Here. Vincent walked out from the back room, wearing a light camel-colored turtleneck sweater with sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing well-defined wrist bones. He was a bit thinner than in college, and his jawline was sharper, but his eyes were the same, gentle with a hint of scrutiny. "Senior." Clara nodded. "Just call me Vincent." He smiled, stepping aside to clear the way. "Come on in and take a look." The first floor is the exhibition area. Tie-dye tapestries, embroidered screens, and woven wall hangings are all displayed under spotlights, with the textures of the fabrics revealed in exquisite detail by the light. Clara's gaze swept over a blue-dyed kimono jacket, its cuffs embroidered with fine silver ripples, the stitching so neat it looked as if it had been measured with a ruler. "Did you make this?" she asked. "Yes. The centerpiece of last year's spring collection." Vincent walked over to her side. "Do you like blue dye?" "I do." She reached out as if to touch it, then pulled her hand back. "May I?" "Exhibits are fine. Items for sale are not." She lightly touched the silver embroidery at her cuff, her fingertips feeling the subtle raised texture. In her past life she had also done embroidery. During those idle afternoons at the Liu residence, she used needle and thread to embroider flowers on scraps of cloth, then tossed them into a drawer once finished. Once, Vivian found them and threw them into the trash right in front of her, saying, "Such things are not worthy of being kept in the Liu household." The second floor is the workshop. Vincent's voice brought her thoughts back. "Shall we go take a look?" The second floor was open plan. Several industrial sewing machines were arranged in 2 rows, and various fabrics and spools of thread were spread across the workbenches by the window. Sunlight poured in through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and dust floated slowly within the beams of light. In the corner stood an old-fashioned wooden loom, its surface worn smooth and gleaming. "It was left to me by my grandmother." Vincent noticed her gaze. "She was the best weaver in town. I grew up watching her weave." Clara stepped closer, her fingers brushing across the loom's beam. The wood grain was fine, bearing the patina of years of handling. "Can you use it?" she asked. "Yes." Vincent pulled a roll of pale blue cotton and a ball of silver-gray silk thread from a nearby cabinet. "Want to give it a try? You learned the basics in an elective course, didn't you?" Clara took the materials and sat down before the loom. She took a deep breath, pressed down on the treadle, passed the shuttle from her left hand to her right, and the thread slipped through the gaps in the warp. The first pass was crooked. The silver thread was caught between 2 warp threads and wouldn't pull through. "Don't rush." Vincent crouched down, tapping the back of her hand with his finger. "Apply even pressure. Don't go fast and slow." His fingers were slightly cool, with well-defined knuckles. Clara steadied herself, the second pass, the third pass. The thread began to weave neatly across the fabric, creating a small section of fine silver patterns. She wove for about 10 centimeters, then stopped to look. The pattern was even, the tension consistent, resembling a shallow stream on the blue cloth. Vincent narrowed his eyes and looked for a long while. "Are you sure you've only learned the basics?" he asked. Clara looked down at her fingers. The sensation of the needle passing through the fabric slowed her heartbeat, like a rhythm rediscovered. "Maybe," she said. "I was born to do this." Vincent didn't speak. He watched the line of her profile. The sunlight cast delicate shadows of her eyelashes onto her cheekbones. He remembered Clara from college, always huddled in the back row of the classroom, her homework submitted with crooked stitching, yet the color schemes were surprisingly good. He had extended an invitation back then, but she refused, saying that this industry isn't respectable. And now here she sat, her fingers as steady as if she had been doing this for 10 years. "Clara," he said, "you've changed." "Have I?" "There was no light in your eyes before," he said. "Now there is." Clara stopped the shuttle in her hand. She thought of George. In 3 years he had never said anything like that. He would only say things like, "Your makeup is too heavy today," "This outfit doesn't suit you," or "Don't look so sullen in front of my sister." "Vincent," she stood up, "thank you for still being willing to take me in." "It's not about taking you in." He took a stack of design drafts from a drawer and flipped to one page. "This is the new product plan for the next season. The theme is sea. If you're interested, this collection is yours." From design to sampling to the finished product, you call the shots the entire way. Clara took the design draft. On the paper were sketches of several tie-dye scarves, the outlines of waves faintly sketched in pencil, with notes beside them reading deep to light blue gradient and silver thread edging. She stared at the character for C, her knuckles turning slightly white. "Why give this to me?" she asked. "I've only been here a day." Vincent leaned against the edge of the desk, arms crossed over his chest. "Because what this series needs," he pointed to the silver wave pattern on the loom, "is exactly what you know how to do." Clara stayed at the workshop until dark. The wind blew in from the direction of Sujo Creek, and she wrapped her coat tighter as she walked toward the subway station. A Malatang stall by the roadside had lit its lights, and white steam mixed with the scent of chili peppers drifted over. A delivery rider brushed past her, the plastic bags in his basket rustling. She glanced down at her phone. Shelley had sent a message. "Tickets bought. Arriving the day after tomorrow." She replied with "okay," put away her phone and walked into the subway entrance. The turnstile beeped, and she swiped her card through, standing at the edge of the platform to wait for the train. Wind surged up from the tunnel, carrying the smell of rails and electric sparks. She suddenly realized she was hungry. She had drunk nothing but that cup of coffee from Vincent all day. The train pulled into the station, the wind blowing up her hair. She boarded, found a seat in a corner, and looked at her reflection in the window. The carriage lights cast her face on the glass in a warm yellow, a stark contrast to the pale, emaciated woman she had been 3 months ago. She leaned back against the seat and closed her eyes for a moment, then heard the announcement. Next station, West Nanjing Road. She opened her eyes. Outside the car window, the walls of the tunnel sped past, the advertising light boxes blurring into a single streak of brightness. She remembered the night she was reborn, leaving the Liu family on this very line. Back then, her hand holding the phone was trembling, and the image of the cliff edge flashed repeatedly through her mind. Now her hand was steady. The train arrived at the station. She stood up, the doors opened and cold air rushed in. She stepped out, walking into the night above ground, and the aroma of spicy hot pot drifted over again. This time she stopped, bought a bowl, and stood by the roadside to finish it before heading home. A week later, when Clara pulled the first sample from the dye vat, the first thing she smelled was the scent, the astringency of fermented indigo, like the smell of earth turned over after the rain. She wrung out the fabric and spread it open. Her fingertips felt the slight stiffness of the cotton fibers after dyeing, different from the softness of undyed cloth. The dyed fabric had a texture as if fixed in time. She hung it on the bamboo pole in the workshop, the sound of dripping water exceptionally clear in the quiet room. Tap, tap, tap like a clock ticking. When it was half dry, she began threading the silver thread. The resistance was greater than usual as the needle pierced the semi-damp fabric, requiring a bit more force with every stitch. Her fingers could sense the faint, grainy friction of the silver thread between the fibers. Unlike the slipperiness of dry cloth, it felt steadier. By the time she finished embroidering the first wave, the sky had darkened, and only the work lamp overhead remained lit in the workshop. She held the fabric sample up to the light. The silver thread on the blue background gleamed with a soft, lustrous matte finish in the warm glow, different from its sparkle under natural light during the day. At night, the silver thread looked like a moon sunk beneath the sea. "That will do." Vincent's voice came from behind her. She turned her head and saw him leaning against the doorframe, having no idea how long he had been watching. "How long have you been standing there?" she asked. "Since you started threading the needle." He walked over, leaned in to look at the fabric sample without touching it. "The sound of the shuttle threading changed when you were embroidering. The first 3 stitches were hesitant. After that, it was smooth." Clara paused for a moment. She had never noticed the change in her own speed when threading the needle. "Can you tell?" she asked. "I'm used to listening." Vincent pointed to his ears. "Fabric, thread, needles, different states produce different sounds. That segment just now was the best part." Clara took the fabric sample down from the bamboo pole and spread it out on the workbench. On the deep blue gradient background, silver thread was embroidered along the flow of the waves into 3 arcs, with the spacing of each arc positioned exactly where it was most visually pleasing. "How many are you planning to make for this series?" Vincent asked. 5, she said. From the deepest indigo to the palest mist blue, a gradient. Will there be too much of a color difference between the 4th and 5th sections? No. She picked up another dyed fabric sample and placed the two side by side under the light to compare. I've tried it. I added a middle shade in between, using a dye bath formula diluted by 1/3. Help me take a look. Does the transition look natural? Vincent lowered his head to look for a few seconds, then reached out to switch the left and right order of the two fabric samples. Put the middle one on this side. The visual transition is smoother. Clara glanced at his adjusted arrangement. It was indeed better than her original sequence. Dark blue to medium blue to light blue, like a coastline at low tide, receding layer by layer. You have a better eye than I do, she said. It comes with practice. Vincent straightened up. You've only done the first batch. Wait until you've done the 100th batch. You'll be even more accurate than me. Clara smiled, packed the fabric swatches away, and placed them in a dust bag. I'll start making the second one tomorrow, she said. The market was set up in an old factory building at M50, with a concrete floor, exposed steel frames, and natural light streaming down through skylights. Clara laid out 4 scarves by color palette, from the deepest indigo to the palest mist blue, like a compressed stretch of sea. The silver threads shimmered under different lights, drawing several passers-by to stop and ask the price. She hadn't decided on the prices yet. Vincent said, "It's up to you." But as she looked at every stitch on the scarves, she felt she couldn't put a price tag on them. Around noon, when there were fewer people, a woman in a black coat stopped in front of her stall. The woman was about 40, with short hair and round-rimmed glasses. She looked down for a long time, then reached out to touch the silver thread embroidery. This one, she pointed to the palest mist blue, is hand-embroidered? Yes. Clara stood up. Satin embroidery, following the tie-dye pattern. Did you make it? I made it. The woman took a business card from her bag and handed it over. I'm the editor-in-chief of Jin's magazine. We're doing a feature on new generation artisans next week. Are you interested? Clara took the business card, pressing her fingertips against the embossed gold lettering. Jin's, the largest circulation lifestyle magazine in the country. In her past life, she had flipped through a few issues on the Liu family's coffee table. They were filled with socialites' jewelry and dinner party outfits. Yes, she said. The woman smiled, glanced at the mist blue scarf again and said, I'll take this one. Leave your contact information, and I'll have my assistant get in touch with you about the interview. As the woman walked away, Clara lowered her head to look at the business card, motionless for a long time. Clara. Shelley emerged from the crowd, holding 2 cups of milk tea. Guess who I just saw? Who? Summer. Shelley placed the milk tea on the table and lowered her voice. She was looking at jewelry at the stall next door, accompanied by guess who William. Clara paused for a moment. That William from Joe's real estate? Yes. They were holding hands, looking very intimate. Shelley bit on her straw. Isn't Summer with George? How come she's with William now? Clara didn't say anything. She thought of her past life. Summer had already been involved with William before marrying George. Later, when the Liu family went bankrupt, the person Summer transferred her assets to was William. The connection between these two went back even earlier than she had thought. Never mind them. She put the business card into her bag. Watch the stall for me. I'm going to the restroom. She walked through the crowd towards the depths of the factory building, and bumped right into someone at the corner. Sorry, she looked up. Summer stood before her in a white cashmere coat, with her hair meticulously styled and a polite smile on her face. Her arm was linked through the elbow of a man in a dark gray suit. William. Clara recognized him. She had seen his photo in a financial magazine in her past life. Clara. Summer showed a surprised expression. Are you here to browse the market too? Clara looked at the hand she had linked with William's and smiled. I'm going to set up a stall. Set up a stall? Summer raised an eyebrow. Shouldn't you be? I mean, after you broke up with George, didn't you find a new job? Sort of. William looked at Clara with great interest. Who is this? Oh, Summer looked up at him. She's George's ex-girlfriend. Clara is a very nice person, especially kind. She voluntarily stepped aside so George and I could be together. Clara looked at the I-1 expression on her face and suddenly found it amusing. Summer, she said. How much of that $870,000 debt do you have left to pay off? Summer's face stiffened for a moment, then quickly returned to normal. What are you talking about? I don't understand. Never mind if you don't understand. Clara walked past her. By the way, George's safe password is his mother's birthday. If you want it, do it soon. He's probably going to change the password soon. She had taken 3 steps when she heard Summer lower her voice behind her and say to William, "How does she know?" The corners of Clara's mouth curled up, and she turned into the restroom. When she returned to the Liu family villa that night, George was already asleep. Summer stood at the door of his bedroom, listening to the steady breathing inside, and did not push the door open. She went back to her room, rummaged through her bag for the phone with the debt collection text message demanding $870,000, and called back using a different number. "Give me 1 more month," she lowered her voice. "I've found a way. The girlfriend of the chairman of the Liu Group is worth that much." The person on the other end said something and she sneered. "Is he not a rich man?" "Of course he isn't. But he has a good background, and the Liu family's reputation still carries some weight in the banking system for another 2 years. 2 years is enough for me to move all my assets." After hanging up the phone, she sat by the bed, looking at the pearl necklace George had given her on the nightstand. Under the light, the pearls glowed with a soft luster. She picked it up and weighed it in her hand. Light as a feather, it couldn't compare to the Patek Philippe William had given her. She opened WeChat and scrolled to George's chat. He had sent her 3 messages again today. "Come home early. There's soup in the kitchen. Is something going on with you lately?" She read them one by one but didn't reply. Then she tapped on William's profile picture and sent a message. "Are you free next week? I want to see you." After sending it, she swiped away George's chat. Just like swiping away a spam message, a light slide of her thumb, without even a glance left to open it. She never hated George. She just didn't need him anymore. That evening, Clara returned to her rental apartment and received a text message from an unfamiliar number. "What I told you at the market today, don't go spreading it around. There are things it's better you just know. Speaking out won't do you any good. Summer." Clara read the message twice, took a screenshot of the text, and then blocked the number. She lay on the single bed in her rented apartment, staring up at the ceiling. The 30-square-meter room still had sticker residue left by the previous tenant on the walls, and the neon lights outside bathed the ceiling in an ambiguous pink. She thought of the room she used to have in the Liu family villa in her past life, 60 square meters with a private bathroom and walk-in closet. Yet she had slept there for 3 years without ever having a single good night's sleep. Her phone vibrated again. This time it was WeChat, a friend request from a contact she hadn't saved. The profile picture was pitch black, and the note read, "Clara, this is George. I'm adding you from my assistant's account. Let's talk." Clara looked at the application, her thumb hovering between approve and reject. She remembered the last time George spoke to her, in the ICU ward just after her amputation, as the anesthesia wore off and she curled up in the sheets, trembling with pain. He stood by the bed and said, "The doctor says your hand is completely useless. Our Liu family can't support a cripple." His tone was flat, as if he were simply saying the cafeteria food didn't suit his taste that day. She tapped reject. Then she put her phone on silent, turned over and closed her eyes. 3 months later, after Clara's C-Series was featured by Gents magazine at the market, she received orders from several buyers one after another. The first batch consisted of only 20 pieces and sold out within a week. Vincent helped her contact a small dyeing workshop, raising production capacity from handmade single pieces to small batch production. That afternoon, as she was rushing to complete the second batch of orders in the workshop, Shelley pushed the door open and held her phone up in front of her. "Take a look at this." On the screen was a screenshot of a financial news article. George, chairman of Liu Group, has incurred company debts of over $20 million due to investment errors, and 3 of its subsidiaries have applied for bankruptcy liquidation. The accompanying photo shows George walking out of court, wearing a black suit with his tie hanging loosely around his neck, looking pale and haggard. He had lost a significant amount of weight compared to before. his cheekbones protruding and dark circles under his eyes. Clara glanced at it and continued with her needlework. "Aren't you surprised?" Shelley put away her phone. "Expected." Clara switched to a silver thread. "I know his company's books all too well. That cultural tourism project he invested in the year before last was a total pit, and last year he blindly expanded physical stores. He was already in the red long ago. It's just that I used to handle the accounts for him and could stall for time, but now there's no one to cover for him." Shelley looked at her calm profile. "What about Summer?" "Summer?" Clara paused her needlework. "She should be with William by now. George is out of money, she won't stay." As soon as the words fell, her phone lit up. A push notification. Summer exposed vacationing in the Maldives with William, vice president of Joe Real Estate. Wedding rumored to be imminent. Shelley gasped. "How did you know?" Clara put down her needlework and smoothed out the half-embroidered fabric. Silver thread traced the final crest of a wave against the indigo background, as fine as a strand of hair. "Because I saw her do the same thing," she said. That same night, George sat in the living room of the Liu family villa. A foreclosure notice from the bank spread out before him. The house was going to be auctioned off next week. Vivian had already moved in with a classmate, and his mother was lying in the hospital with 3 stents in her heart. Summer didn't come home today. Her wardrobe was empty, the jewelry box on her vanity was empty, and the cash and gold bars in the safe were empty too. When he tried to open the safe, he found the password had been changed. After having someone pry it open, only a few expired coupons remained inside. He sat on the sofa, his phone screen glowing. It was the last message from Summer. "George, I'm sorry, I have my own difficulties too. Don't look for me." He stared at those words for a long time, wanting to call and yell at her, but only realized he had been blocked after dialing the number. He threw his phone onto the coffee table. It bounced off and fell to the floor, the screen cracking. The living room was very quiet. The fireplace wasn't lit. The heating was off, and cold air seeped in through the cracks in the window. He suddenly remembered the day Clara left. It was a winter day just like this one. She was wearing an old gray coat, her hair tied back casually, not even wearing any makeup. She said, "George, you're free," then pushed open the door and walked out. The door closed very softly. Back then he thought she was just throwing a tantrum. He had always thought she was just throwing a tantrum. He bent down to pick up the phone with its cracked screen and scrolled to Clara's chat window. Still the red exclamation mark. He stared at that exclamation mark, his thumb rubbing against the screen for a long time. Then he opened his contacts and found someone he hadn't been in touch with for a long time, Vincent. "Mr. Vincent, this is George. Could you give me Clara's contact information? She blocked me. There are some things I want to say to her." The message was sent and the other party replied instantly. "I can't do that. She doesn't want to be disturbed. Please respect her wishes." George looked at the line of text, placed his phone face down on the sofa cushion, and leaned his head back against the backrest. It started to rain outside. Raindrops struck the glass and trickled down the cracks like tear streaks. 3 days later, when Clara saw Vincent at the workshop, he handed her an envelope. "George had someone drop this off at the studio. I was going to throw it away, but since it's for you, you decide." Clara opened the envelope. Inside was a photograph and a handwritten letter. The photo showed a sea, not the sea in Shanghai, but the one in Sanya, azure and clear, with the sunlight turning the water surface into shattered gold. On the back was written a line. "You said before that you wanted to see the sea, but I never took you." She looked at that line, thinking for a long while before she remembered. 3 years ago on her birthday she said to George, "Let's go see the sea," and he replied, "Busy, let's talk about it next year." Later she brought it up every birthday and every year he said, "Next year." Until she died she never saw that sea. The handwritten letter was even shorter, only 4 lines. "Clara, I was wrong. The company is gone, the house is gone, Summer has left. Only now do I realize how much you did before. I don't ask for your forgiveness. I just want to say I'm sorry. It's enough that you're doing well. George." Clara folded the letter and stuffed it back into the envelope. "Are you going to reply?" Vincent asked. "No." She placed the envelope on the corner of the desk. "He needs to say he's sorry. I don't need it." Vincent said nothing more. He just walked over to her and glanced at the new piece she was working on at the workbench. A dark gray wool shawl embroidered with a full moon in the Sioux embroidery style. The moonlight was silvery white, the stitches so fine it looked as if it were truly glowing. "What series is this?" he asked. Tentatively called Moon. Clara picked up the needle and continued stitching. "The sea is freedom, the moon is tranquility. I want to create 2 parallel series, one looking outward, one looking inward." Vincent stood beside her and watched for a long time. Her fingers were steady, and there was almost no sound as the silver needle passed through the wool fabric. The contours of her profile were somewhat softer than before. Right after her rebirth, her face had always been taut, as if ready to fight someone at any moment. Now that tension had eased into a calm focus. "Clara," he said, "there is an exhibition next month at the Shanghai Exhibition Center. The International Craft Art Exhibition. I've signed you up. If the C series is selected, international buyers will come to see it." Clara stopped her needlework and looked up. "International exhibition?" "Yes. The highest Goigra exhibition in the domestic handicraft field," said Vincent. "Your work is up to standard, but selection requires a jury vote, so I can't guarantee it." Clara lowered her head to look at the shawl under her hands. The full moon was already more than half embroidered, with silver threads shimmering with a soft luster on the gray woolen fabric. She thought of her past self before her rebirth, when she was lying by the cliff waiting to die. The moonlight she saw then was just like this. Cold, distant, shining impartially on everyone. "I'll give it a try," she said. The International Handicraft Exhibition was held for 3 consecutive days at the Shanghai Exhibition Center. Clara's C series was positioned at the entrance of the Contemporary Handicraft section, where 5 scarves were spread out under spotlights, their gradient from indigo to misty blue resembling a segmented C. The silver thread embroidery shimmered at different angles under the light, drawing several groups of European buyers to stop and linger. On the afternoon of the second day, the president of the jury, an elderly Frenchwoman, stood in front of her booth for nearly 10 minutes. Wearing white gloves, the elderly woman gently touched the embroidery on a misty blue scarf and asked her in accented English, "Why did you use silver thread for these waves?" Clara replied in English, "Because of the light. The light on the sea isn't even. It's fragmented, dancing. The silver thread is the trace of the light." The elderly woman gave her a look and nodded. On the third day, at the closing ceremony, as the host announced the winner of the Best Newcomer Award, Clara sat in the second row, her fingers clutching the fabric on her knees. When she heard her name come through the microphone, her mind buzzed, and her legs felt a little weak as she stood up. She walked onto the stage and accepted the crystal trophy, transparent, with a half-bloomed flower carved inside. The lights shone down from above, and the trophy refracted a small patch of rainbow in her hand. Below the stage, a sea of camera flashes went off. She saw Vincent standing at the back of the crowd, giving her a slight nod. Shelley was nearby, holding up her phone to record, already crying her eyes out. "Thank you," she said into the microphone, her voice trembling slightly. "Thank you to my partner Vincent, thank you to my friend Shelley, and," she paused, "thank you to myself, for surviving." When she said the last 3 words, the audience paused for a moment, and then the applause grew even louder. After the awards ceremony ended, she walked out of the exhibition center. At the bottom of the steps, there was a pushcart selling roasted sweet potatoes. White steam rose from the metal stove, and the sweet aroma mingled with the cold wind. She walked down and bought one, so hot that she kept shifting it between her 2 hands. She peeled off the skin and took a bite. The sweet potato flesh melted on her tongue, hot and sweet. Vincent caught up from behind, holding the scarf she had left on her seat. "Why are you running so fast?" "I'm hungry," she mumbled with her mouth stuffed with a sweet potato. "I haven't eaten anything all day." Vincent laughed as he watched her gasping from the heat. He reached out, took the sweet potato from her hand, broke it in half and handed one half back to her. "Eat slowly." Clara took the half sweet potato and took a bite, looking down. The wind blew her hair across her face, and she tucked it behind her ear. The steam from the sweet potato brushed against her face, warm and cozy. "Clara," Vincent called her. That French judge just told me your work reminded her of her grandmother's cottage by the sea in Brittany." Vincent said. Her grandmother also did embroidery and never left that village her entire life. She didn't tell you herself because she was afraid it would make you nervous. Clara stopped chewing and looked up. Did she really say that? The exact words were, "She reminds me of how my grandmother used to sew curtains," Vincent said. I think it's a compliment. Clara looked down at the sweet potato in her hand, the corners of her mouth slowly curving upward. Then thank her for me. I already did. Vincent put his hands back in his pockets. Let's go. Shelley is waiting for us across the street for dinner. She said she booked a hot pot place. The two walked down the steps and crossed the street. The streetlights turned the ground stark white. The iron stove of the baked sweet potato stall was still steaming, and the sweet scent trailed after them for a long way. At the same time, at another hospital in Shanghai, George leaned against the hospital bed, and poured drip in his hand. The car accident had happened last month. He had rear-ended a truck while driving drunk, breaking 2 ribs and rupturing his spleen. He lay in the ICU for 10 days before being transferred to a general ward. The doctor said if he had been brought in half an hour later, he wouldn't have made it. On the night he was brought in, the recent call history in his phone's contacts was full of Summer's number, but every call went unanswered. The traffic police searched through his phone and found the numbers labeled mother and sister to call. One was turned off, and the other rang 7 times before being hung up. Finally, it was the traffic officer who used their own phone to call 120. When he woke up, the hospital room was empty. Vivian had come once, stayed for 20 minutes, and then hurried to leave, saying she had plans to have dinner with a friend. His mother was still in the cardiology department, and she had a caregiver come over to check on him every day. When he scrolled past the news about Clara winning an award on his phone, he was eating a bowl of congealed porridge. In the photo, she stood on stage wearing a dark blue shirt, her hair cut a bit shorter. She had lost weight but looked in good spirits. The crystal trophy in her hand glared blindingly under the lights. He watched for a long time. The porridge had gone completely cold, and a film had formed on the rim of the bowl. He remembered 3 years ago. At that time, Clara had just graduated and asked him, "Can I do handmade fabric arts?" He replied, "That kind of thing has no future. It's a waste of time." She never mentioned the matter again, and began learning to help him review financial reports, receive clients, and take care of his younger sister. She learned quickly, even becoming more proficient than the veteran employees in his company, but he never once praised her. He took it for granted. He swiped away the news page, opened WeChat, and saw that the pin chat still displayed a red exclamation mark. He typed, "Congratulations on the award. I saw the news." And sent it. Red exclamation mark. The other party is not your friend. He placed his phone face down on the nightstand and closed his eyes. 4 months later, Clara held her first solo exhibition at the Shanghai International Craft Fair. The Sea Series and the Moon Series were displayed side by side. One side featuring tie-dye scarves with silver threads in varying shades of blue, the other showcasing embroidered wool capes in grayish-white tones. The 2 series were like day and night, one surging outward, the other sinking inward in serenity. Quite a few people attended on opening day. Several European buyers placed orders on the spot. Jin's magazine ran a cover feature, and even a Japanese kimono brand contacted her about a potential collaboration. Clara stood in the exhibition hall wearing an indigo shirt she had dyed herself, speaking with every visitor in an unhurried, measured tone. In the afternoon, when there were few people, a figure walked into the entrance of the exhibition hall. Clara looked up and saw George standing at the entrance. He was leaning on a cane. His right leg was still not quite nimble after the car accident. He had lost a great deal of weight, and wearing a crumpled black coat, he looked out of place against the white walls of the exhibition hall. His gaze swept over the waves and full moons embroidered with silver thread on the display wall, finally landing on her. Clara looked at him, not moving. George walked over step by step with his cane, stopping 3 steps away from her. The exhibition hall was very quiet, and there were 2 other guests viewing the exhibition nearby, speaking in hushed tones. "Let me take a look," he said, his voice a little hoarse. "Welcome," Clara said, her tone flat. "You can touch the exhibits, but you need to wear gloves. They're over there." George didn't put on gloves. He just stood there, his gaze falling on the centerpiece of the C-series behind her. The one with the deepest indigo, embroidered with 3 silver ripples that glinted with fragmented light under the spotlight. "It's beautiful," he said. "Thank you." There was a silence, neither long nor short. George moved his lips as if to say something but swallowed the words back. Finally he just lowered his head, looking at the hand gripping his cane. "I just came to look," he said. "As long as you're doing well, that's enough." He turned and walked away. The cane tapped against the white floor tiles of the exhibition hall. One tap after another, the sound very soft. Clara watched his back disappear at the entrance of the exhibition hall, then withdrew her gaze and continued explaining the embroidery craftsmanship of the Moon series to the waiting guest beside her. That night after the exhibition closed, Vincent helped her pack up the exhibits. The two of them folded the scarves and shawls one by one and placed them into dust bags, turning off the lights in the exhibition hall one by one, until only the security light at the entrance remained on. "Are you tired today?" Vincent asked. "I'm all right." Clara packed the last scarf and straightened her back. "It's easier than tie-dyeing 50 pieces of fabric." Vincent chuckled. He lowered his head to seal the cardboard box, and without looking up said casually, "Clara, I'm going to Kyoto for 2 months next month for a residency at a kimono workshop. Do you want to come along?" Clara paused for a moment. "What for?" "To learn new dyeing and weaving techniques. That workshop's indigo dyeing has a history of 400 years. It's completely different from the techniques we use now." Vincent finally looked up at her, a hint of probing in his eyes. "You could redo your C-series from a different angle. Of course, if you don't want to go." "I'm going," Clara interrupted him. Vincent blinked. "Just like that?" "Why not just like that?" Clara zipped up the dust bag and straightened up to look at him. "Vincent, I no longer live for anyone else. If I want to go, I go." Vincent looked at her for a couple of seconds, and the corners of his mouth slowly curved up. "All right," he said. "Then I'll book the flight." The two walked out of the exhibition hall side by side. Outside was the night in Shanghai. Clara stood on the steps and exhaled a breath of white mist, looking up at the sky. It was clear today, and a few stars were barely visible against the backdrop of neon lights. Her gaze lingered on those faint starlights for a moment, then fell back to the near distance. The streetlights stretched their shadows in the same direction, one long and one short, overlapping. "Vincent," she called him. You said that workshop's indigo dyeing has been around for 400 years. What plant dyes do they use?" "Indigo." "Is it different from the banlangen we use?" "It is different. The fermentation time is longer, and the color is deeper." Clara thought for a moment. "Then the embroidery technique for the silver thread should also change. Finer needles, closer spacing. Otherwise it won't hold down that base color." Vincent turned his head to look at her. She stood beneath the street lamp, her eyes bright, more serious when speaking of Eisen than when speaking of anything else. He recalled how she looked the first time he saw her in the workshop, thin, wary, with a knife hidden in her eyes. And now that knife had been set down, turning into a fire. "We'll study it together when the time comes," he said. Clara lowered her head and smiled, then pulled her scarf up a bit to cover her chin. She was wearing the gray scarf Vincent had knitted again today, the gold thread glinting under the street lamp. "Vincent," she took a step forward then stopped, turning to look at him. "Why are you so good to me?" Vincent didn't answer immediately. He looked up at the sky. Tonight there was a first quarter moon, a slender curve hanging between the buildings, cold and quiet. "You know I sought you out 3 times back in college, right?" he said. "I know. The first 2 times I genuinely thought you had talent. The third time," he paused. "The third time was because I was sitting in the classroom watching you in the last row, head down, embroidering a handkerchief. You spent the whole afternoon at it. The sunlight from the window fell on the back of your neck. You had tucked your hair behind your ear, exposing that small patch of skin reddened by the sun. When you finished and looked out the window, that expression made me feel." He paused, as if searching for the right words. "It makes me feel that if this person isn't by my side, I'll keep thinking about her." Clara clutched the edge of her scarf, saying nothing. Vincent turned to look at her, the street lamp casting his face in half light. So going to Kyoto isn't just about learning indigo dyeing, he said. I want to see the farther sea with you. Not the gray, dusty sea like in Shanghai, but the kind so clean you can see the bottom. You'll like it. Clara looked at him, her gaze shifting from his eyes to his hands, those slender, well-defined hands, hands that held a needle, and also the hands that had just said, I want to with you. She lowered her head and pulled her scarf up a bit, covering the lower half of her face. Vincent stood under the streetlight, the corners of his mouth slowly curving upward. He turned and followed, walking a bit faster than before. As they walked past the streetlight side by side, their shadows lengthened then shortened, then lengthened again, like a melody being drawn out, swaying gently before coming back together. Let's go, Clara said. Tomorrow we have to go to the dye house to keep an eye on the new batch of color samples. Okay. The footsteps of the two people echoed on the empty street, one behind the other, gradually falling into step. 3 months later, Kyoto. Clara sat on the floor of the Machiya workshop, a large dye vat before her. The scent of indigo mixed with the musty smell of the wooden beams, and the grassy fragrance of the tatami, rising and falling within this 400-year-old house. As she submerged the fabric into the dye vat, she heard the sound of the liquid churning, muffled like water flowing deep underground. When she fished it out, the fabric was yellowish-green. She spread it out over a bamboo pole and watched it slowly turn blue in the air. It was a slow change, almost imperceptible to the naked eye, but checking every few minutes, the color would deepen a shade, irreversible like a sunset. Vincent sat opposite, grinding a needle. He held an extremely fine embroidery needle between his fingers, rubbing it back and forth against a whetstone with a rasping sound, like spring silkworms eating mulberry leaves. You're not grinding it right, Clara said. What's not right? Your angle is too high. She stood up and walked over, squatting beside him, reaching out to adjust the wrist of the hand holding the needle. Flatten it a bit. Let the belly of the needle touch the stone, not the tip. Her fingertips pressed against the bone of his wrist, and Vincent's hand paused for a moment. Like this, he asked. She withdrew her hand and returned to her seat. Try again. Vincent sharpened it a few more times, and the sound of the needle against the whetstone became denser. Much better, he said. Clara picked up her half-dry fabric again and continued embroidering. The sound of the silver-gray thread moving across the dark blue background was very soft, like the friction of turning a page. It started to snow outside. The snowflakes landing on the skylight melted into droplets, and the trails trickling down the glass were reflected by the indoor warm light into fine, bright streaks. When she finished embroidering a ripple and looked up at the skylight, she saw the reflection of the Machiya's beams within the water droplets, stretched long and swaying slightly. Vincent. You say this workshop has been around for 400 years, she said. 400 years. Just imagine how many people must have sat before this dye vat, doing the exact same thing? I don't know. Vincent held the sharpened needle up to the light to examine it. But if it's lasted 400 years, that shows it's something worth doing. Clara looked down at the scarf taking shape in her hands. Silvery gray waves stretched endlessly across the dark blue fabric, running from one end to the other like a frozen coastline. She suddenly felt that she too was a single stitch in these 400 years. Nothing special, but stitched into a particular place. Go on. She rethreaded the needle. There are still 3 ripples to embroider. A year later, Clara sat before the loom at the Weaving Words workshop, her feet on the treadles, the shuttle passing from her left hand to her right. The friction of the silk threads passing through the warp was fine and even, like rain falling on tiles. She wove for the entire morning, producing a length of cloth about 2 meters long. Silver-gray fine threads were woven into a dark blue background, not embroidered, but woven together with the fabric. The texture of the threads blended seamlessly with the cloth. It felt smooth to the touch, but when the light hit it, the silver threads emerged. Shelley pushed the door open just as she was taking the fabric off the loom. Clara, you're trending again. Shelley rushed over, holding up a tablet. Clara took the tablet and glanced at it. The top 10 global new craftsmen of the year, selected by an Italian design magazine, and she was ranked 4th. The accompanying photo was taken earlier this year in Kyoto while dyeing cloth. She was wearing an apron from the Machiya workshop, her hands covered in indigo blue, holding up a freshly dyed piece of fabric to examine it against the skylight. After looking at it, she handed the tablet back and continued spreading the woven fabric on the workbench to tidy the edges. How come you're not excited at all? Shelley sat down beside her. I'm so excited. Clara measured the edge of the fabric with a ruler, drawing a straight line with her pencil. But this piece needs to be cut today and sent out tomorrow. Shelley looked at her profile as she measured the fabric and sighed. You're becoming more and more like Vincent. What is it like? As soon as I get to the workshop, I don't recognize anyone. Vincent's voice came from downstairs. Shelley, don't disturb her. Come back up when you're done cutting. Clara laughed, and the scissors in her hand cut steadily along the penciled line. As the fabric was sliced open, it made a crisp tearing sound, like a straight line being clarified. She finished trimming the last edge, held the fabric up against the window to look. The late winter sunlight slanted in through the glass, and the patterns woven in silver thread over the deep blue fabric floated in the light, like a breathing sea. She folded the fabric, placed it in a paper bag, walked to the window and pushed it open. Cold air rushed in, but it no longer bit to the bone as it had 3 years ago. The wind carried a faint, elusive warmth, and the sky between the distant buildings was a pale gray blue, a shade lighter than winter's leaden gray. A few birds skimmed past the cluster of buildings, their wings beating at a slow rhythm, as if strolling with no particular destination. Vincent came up from downstairs, holding a cup of hot tea, and stopped beside her. He handed the tea to her. She took it and cupped it in her palms, not drinking, just letting it warm her hands. What are you thinking about? He asked. Clara looked out the window and narrowed her eyes. Think back to this time 3 years ago, she said. Lying on the edge of a cliff, thinking I was going to die there. Vincent didn't speak. He simply stood beside her, looking at the sky in the same direction. And then, he asked. Later. She turned her head to glance at him, the corners of her mouth curving slightly. Later someone told me that he had been waiting for me all along. Vincent's lips also curved into a smile, but he didn't respond. They just stood side by the window, watching the sky outside slowly shift from gray-blue to a pale golden hue. The sun was about to set, burning the edges of the clouds into a narrow, bright line. Clara lowered her head and took a sip of tea. Vincent reached out to tuck a stray lock of hair, blown by the wind, behind her ear. His touch was gentle, as if he were afraid of breaking something. She didn't pull away. The wind from outside poured in through the open window, rustling the corner of the freshly cut deep blue fabric on the workbench. Waves woven with silver thread undulated slightly in the breeze, like a real sea breathing quietly. From afar came the sound of pigeon whistles, drifting now near, now far, circling the horizon at dusk. Clara set down her teacup. She lowered her head to look at the dregs remaining in the bottom of the cup, and after 2 seconds reached out to take Vincent's hand, which was still resting by her ear. Her fingers were slightly cool. They paused for a moment when they touched the back of his hand, then gently closed around it. Shall we go to the dye house tomorrow to look at the new color samples? She asked. Okay. Vincent clasped her hand in return, his fingers interlacing with hers. Together. The light outside the window slowly, inch by inch, dimmed, then brightened again. The lights of a building in the distance came on first, followed by a second, then a third, like stars rising one by one from the city's ground. Clara watched those lights and thought of herself standing at the entrance of the Liu family villa on the night of her rebirth. Back then she thought the light was far away, and that she would have to walk a long time to reach it. Now she knew the light didn't need to be sought. The light would come on its own, as long as you kept moving forward.